Hello and welcome everyone to the Wall Street Blockchain Alliance's Crypto Roundup for Friday, April 26, 2024. Ron Quaranta here with my amazing co-host, the one, the only Mr. David Brill. Our roaming co-host, Joshua Ashley Klayman, I think is stepping off a stage somewhere, David. So we can give her some grief for showing up a little late, but she's giving a speech and we're really looking forward to learning more. So thank you all for being here on LinkedIn and on X. If you've got questions for David or Josh and I, please do put them in the comments. We're happy to address them. Please also keep in mind, as per our usual, nothing discussed is accounting, investment, legal, or tax advice. And when David and I are talking about tokens, I promise you we are not endorsing any particular token. David, we had a week off last week. We've all been very, very busy. How are you, brother? It's good to see you. And let's hit it off. There's a lot of news to discuss.
Yes, I feel like we in crypto, a month in crypto is sometimes like a year in real life, and this past month has been one of those years. It feels like, but we've had a lot of regulatory movement, a lot of market movement, and I think this announcement of Consensus filing suit against the SEC is quite interesting. What do you think about that, Ron?
Well, I haven't worked or consulted or talked to the Consensus folks in a while, but they're one of the OGs in this space. They've been there as an Ethereum developer for many years. And I haven't read the entirety of the case, but David, it's really interesting to me. It's almost this sort of sense of two things. One is industry participants with deep benches of legal expertise and deep pockets who are building things are not afraid to push back and are not afraid to sue for the clarity the industry has said it needs. And this seems to me, not that the others are not significant, but this particular case and the suit they put forward is Ethereum's not a security. We need a court to decide now. It's almost this sense of finality to a conversation that's been going on for many, many years. You and I remember back when Commissioner Hinman in the day said it was sufficiently decentralized, and members of the ecosystem have hung on to that for a while. It's almost a sense of, hey, regulator, put up or shut up. That's why they're suing. And I'm sure there's more complicated legal details there. But I think it's an important case. I'll be following it. It'll be interesting to see where it goes. Are you seeing it the same way, David?
So I'm seeing it in two ways. In one way, since Consensus has told us that they received a Wells notice, there's Josh.
Hello, Joshua.
So since Consensus has told us that they received the Wells notice, it feels like this was, I shouldn't say it feels like, without, exact knowledge, personal knowledge, but it looks like that they had this complaint on the shelf.
Yeah.
And
hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
We can hear you now, Josh. How are you?
She can't hear us. Okay.
Well,
it feels like Consensus, obviously they knew this was coming, and they decided to take the preemptive step to bring it in a jurisdiction that they thought would be beneficial to them. And so they had this complaint prepared and it seemed like ready to go. And then on top of that, it looks like they're using the same team from Wachtell that Coinbase is using. And I think that's really smart for two reasons. One is obviously the Wachtell team is a sharp group.
Sure.
And good advocates, but also there's sort of this combined knowledge that group must have now, representing Coinbase and in their litigation, and then representing Consensus. So I think that makes a lot of sense, and I think that you're really seeing this coordinated effort by the regulators to try and clamp down again on crypto, and it's it's sort of one step forward, two step back. You get stablecoin, potential stablecoin legislation, and then you get this flurry of suits. One, the Wells notice against Consensus, then this action against this wallet, Samurai wallet, and then a third with this IRS broker regs, and proposed form that would eviscerate privacy for self-hosted wallets. So it's really, I feel like we're seeing sort of a regulatory choke point, maybe 3.0 or 2.5.
Yeah.
And it's a little unfortunate.
Selfless plug here. When you speak about the 1099 DA form, WSBA, on May 1st, we have at 11 a.m. Eastern, we have an open public webinar on IRS form 1099 DA. The challenges, we've got an amazing team from Legible, some Sean Stein Smith will be there as well, Nick Farr, and some others. Great presentation. So if you could all join us, that'll be great. David, on the suit, just I wanted to dive into two things there, and it's a conversation you and I have had for many years. I believe they use the phrase again, capricious and arbitrary, in the suit, which we've heard many, many times, particularly when it comes to the Securities and Exchange Commission. And I think the other thing they also raise, and I'd be interested in your perspective, I know you're not a litigator, but we've also brought up the Administrative Procedures Act. And I wonder, is that really not helping the industry? I don't recall a case where a court came back and said, yes, the regulator violated the Administrative Procedures Act. I could be wrong, but are we putting too much in that old saw of the APA? What are your thoughts about that?
Well, no, look, I mean, I think with regulations, there are boundaries to how they're enacted, and the way they're enacted. And I do think it's worth mentioning. And look, there are times when the different regulators have had like a very short time frame to respond to proposed regulations, and they've been forced to work within the constructs of the law when pushed back upon. So no, I don't think so at all. And look, government does represent the people. And so it should be, it should be done in a manner as prescribed in the regulations, and ideally in the spirit of those regulations. And it's very interesting because it feels like this is the last gasp of the commission sort of throwing these cases against the wall to see what may or may not stick. Because again, the courts have generally ruled, in favor of some of the, crypto plaintiffs, and we've seen, some positive rulings. And, look, if Ether being a security was a real concern for the commission, they've had almost 8 years to address it.
Yep.
Even if it's changed from the proof of work to proof of stake, where is the harm? And, this is again a theme that I keep bringing up. But where is the harm? Who's being harmed? And if this was such a risk to, markets in general, then where has the action been all this time? And why take it now in the middle of 2024? It just doesn't seem like it's consistent with what people want in the U.S. and what consistent with the markets in the U.S. And I think that's problematic.
David, it's interesting, and I know Josh is trying to. She's remote on location, so apologies to the audience. We'll hopefully get Josh on camera as soon as we can. The other thing about that, David, we've had this conversation. Let's see if we've got Josh again. Is that the one, the only Joshua Ashley Klayman?
It is, and I'm dialed in on my phone now because apparently the computer wasn't cooperating. So.
You shouldn't be taking your Commodore 64 to conferences. Josh, thanks for joining. I wanted to just finish one point with David, and then Josh would love your thoughts. We're talking about the consensus suit against the SEC. And David, one of the things you and I and Josh have often spoken about in the past was really this idea. And you mentioned, what is the harm? Now, you could make a logical argument that says Ethereum started a decade ago, give or take. I'm probably off. And that is a much larger ecosystem now, and that kind of action potentially endangers a much larger number of people with significant economic downside, particularly given the L2s and other capabilities that have been built on Ether. And I ask this question a lot, David and Josh. Is that not part of a regulator's consideration? We understand the mission, we understand investor protections and monitoring securities markets, but don't they consider that? I'm curious about the calculus there.
Well, they should. It's not clear how much of that is, being considered right now, but it's something they should. But I think bringing a case against Ethereum has a broader impact because so many of these protocols are built on top of Ethereum. And so, strategically, I think that, the commission is seeing this as important from their legal strategy to bring this action. But I don't know that it's in the best interest of the public. And,
fair point.
I wonder aloud about that.
Yeah. And I want to point out for the audience that Josh is on location and David and I have a bone to pick. I believe, Josh, you're just stepping off the stage from a keynote at an important event we'd love you to talk about. And neither David nor I were invited to witness the keynote. We have some questions after the broadcast. But Josh, what are you up to?
So as you noted, I just finished my keynote at Cornell Blockchain conference, which has been great. It's at the Cornell Tech campus, and I saw our friend Jason Brett, who is here, as well as some others from the WSBA, including Michelle Gitlitz, and others are also speaking on panels and things like that. Alexandra also Shive is also speaking on a regulatory panel.
Yep.
So it's a good showing, and hopefully, I'm sure they would love to have you guys next year. But yeah, so that's where I am, and my apologies for the difficulty connecting with the computer. Is it okay if I weigh in on some of what was just
Please.
said by David and what you just asked, Ron?
Yeah, please.
Sure,
Go for it.
With apologies that since I was struggling to connect, so I may be retreading ground that you guys have already covered. I think, Ron, your point is a great one. I mean, one of the reasons that people often used as a rationale for why they believed that former Director Hinman of the SEC had given that speech, the speech in which he mentioned being sufficiently decentralized, right? And saying, holding aside whatever may have happened with the initial fundraising, current day offers and sales of ETH, in his view, were not sales of securities. And that was a 2018 speech.
Yeah.
One of the reasons that people surmised that he gave that speech was because they wanted to prevent the harm. They didn't want to create the harm that they were trying to protect against.
Yep.
Right. And that as of 2018, ETH and Ethereum, the blockchain, formed such a big component of the industry that it was important, and it would have caused the downfall of a lot of different projects. Now, that was right after the ICO heyday, where we saw a lot of ERC20 and other tokens. It is certainly there. But I would, as you noted, Ron, things have only built from there. Yeah. So the idea now that rationale perhaps may not be used is interesting. I think because we haven't seen, to my knowledge, and I'm still going through, so all caveats apply with respect to the filing, but there was reference to a Wells notice, indicating that the SEC was potentially intending to bring suit against Consensus. But I think as of right now, it's not clear whether these allegations would be tied to the initial ICO or to the later actions that Gary Gensler had been talking about a few years ago in connection, with the pre-merge activities. In any event, I really think that, Wachtel's brief, in the very first paragraph, I think sums it up very well. It says this action is about regulatory overreach, the ambition of the administrative state to control innovative technologies, and elementary principles of fairness and due process.
Yeah. Josh, it's a really good point. I want to, if we could peel back the layers of the case itself, one of the things that always jumps out for me, and for everyone in the audience, again, thank you so much for joining us. If you've got questions for Josh or David or me, please put them in the chat. It seems the SEC very much, Josh, hinges on staking. When we look at the history, ETH moved from proof of work to proof of stake and successfully moved there. And there's this idea that validators, which get some remuneration for maintaining the network, they're now developing securities. They're now trading in securities unregistered. David, let's start with you. I'm trying to piece this together as a non-attorney. What's the logic behind calling a network validator a participant in an unregistered securities offering?
I'm going to give that one to Josh first, because I've been really thinking about the broker part of the lawsuit that they've been filing. So Josh, I'm going to give that one to you first.
I mean,
oh no,
it's a good question. I mean, one might say, okay, well, are people relying upon the efforts of the validators to get a return, right? But I think it's important to remember that this is an important and critical, in fact, function for a proof of stake blockchain, right? Yeah. Of these natures. So I think there are simplistic ways to look at things, and then there are ways to say, well, if this is how we're going to if proof of stake is going to be the way forward, because look at all the attacks that folks have launched from various angles on proof of work, including from climate and other perspectives. If I just think, that, but certainly someone could, and certainly probably, regulators may make that argument, and it's worth considering. But yeah, I mean, I think it goes to the very heart of how the network is designed to function, whether someone's looking to, quote, profit or speculate, or to use the system, right? Because that's how the system works. So I think that's a critical point here.
David, talk about the broker aspect of this. You raised this a moment earlier, and it is really interesting how we're seeing a regulator's perspective or proposed definition of broker is a really problematic thing in the 21st century, looking at distributed ledger technology. What are you seeing from that perspective?
Well, it's interesting because the SEC lost on the, in the Coinbase case on this idea that the wallet transactions create, a broker dealer relationship. And so it looks like it's another bite of the apple here with MetaMask. And, I think that it's interesting because I understand tactically that the commission doesn't want to have negative precedent sitting out there.
Yeah.
They want to see a split in the court so that they could appeal it. But ultimately, I think a lot of people are of the belief that if this were to get to, the Supreme Court, and the leanings of the Supreme Court on overregulation by administrative bodies, I don't think it would be a good outcome for the commission. So, I understand sort of the tactics, but, it's very interesting. Like these kind of tactics you'd see in sort of high stakes litigation between two private parties.
Yeah.
You wouldn't necessarily expect, government regulators to sort of be engaging in this type of activity. And ideally, like if the courts were to rule in a certain way, you'd like to see that they would agree with those rulings and move forward on them. But it's interesting that they're being very tactical in this way. But I will say on the flip side, I still think that there's been an underappreciation of the legal talent and expertise being brought to bear against these allegations. And really, you're seeing Wachtell and Sullivan and Cromwell and some of the other really top firms in the country, litigating on behalf of the crypto industry. I think it's going to be a tall order for the commission to really overcome that.
Is it the throw the spaghetti against the wall and see what sticks strategy, David?
I think it's more calculated than that. I think that they're trying to play their version of chess.
Yep.
And, I think they're playing against someone who's well-versed in chess, or parties in the aggregate that are well-versed in chess. And, I don't know, there really feels like this is the last sort of gasp of trying to throw some cases against the community, because at this point feels like with the election coming up, there really could be a sea change in the view of crypto, depending on the outcome of the election.
Josh, I cut you off earlier. Go ahead. I know you wanted to add something.
Oh, I was just going to say, this leads me back to some of what we were discussing previously. At least that's my recollection that we discussed it previously. Maybe it was a dream. But just that, never know, right? That, the SEC, if we think about that letter from Senator Reid and the other senator, I can't remember which one, to Gary Gensler, right? Saying essentially no more spot crypto ETFs.
Yep.
There's been a real tidal wave of momentum towards, in my view, a spot ether ETF. And as we noted, the SEC potentially could end up with similar struggles, having let ETH futures go forward. It could end up back in the same position where, as we saw, Grayscale had to bring suit against them, and then it was determined by that court that the SEC had acted arbitrarily and capriciously in the denial of Bitcoin ETF, because there were really no non-correlating arguments. Like none of their arguments were not also arguments that had some bearing or were relevant with respect to the approval of Bitcoin futures. So, this case and cases like it and any kind of enforcement action that may come down by the SEC on this point, it's going to take a long time potentially to figure out what it will do as it works its way through the courts, is potentially provide a basis for the SEC denying a spot Ether ETF.
Yeah, David, Josh, good points. We're kind of talking about DC, so let's dive into our trip last week. For the rest of the folks in the audience, I had the privilege of traveling to Washington, DC with David, with Josh. Shout out to Kayvon Sadeghi, to Phil Berg, to Linda Lerner, to Dina Ellis, who joined us in this kind of educational contingent. We met some staffers. That was really, really great conversation. And we also had the privilege of talking to one of the SEC commissioners. David, let's start with you. It was a brief trip, a day and change, and it was great to see everyone in person in a beautiful city. Washington, to me, is a really beautiful city. What were your takeaways in some of those conversations? And I know that we've got work to do to respond to some of that, but I'd love your perspective. Then, Josh, I'd love yours as well.
Well, as I reflect on, the last time we went as a group several years ago, I think it was before the pandemic, maybe it was 2019. Right. Look, the knowledge and the questions and the conversation we've had, are just considerably more elevated in this visit than the ones that we had previously. And I think, the crypto community has some real allies on the Hill that want to see this industry move forward. So I think, I would say mostly positive. I think that, there is real engagement. I think there is still, some challenges, with the way the commission views crypto industry. And so I think those are things we as an industry have to work through. And I think there are things that we left Washington with that we can work on to help Congress and legislators be more informed about the breadth of the industry and the usefulness of the industry. I also want to mention Steve Rutenberg was part of our
Rutenberg, yes.
I don't want Steve to feel left out.
Not at all. Steve Rutenberg, shout out, buddy.
I want to make one other point. Look, we've seen a lot of interest in the Bitcoin ETF, and I can only imagine there'd be somewhat similar or the same interest in the Ether ETF. And preventing this being offered to customers in a securities wrapper, again, where's the harm? Where's the harm? And, this is sort of the will of the people. People want this. They want access to it. Institutions want access to it. So, you're really working against the majority of people who want access to this. And again, nobody's being compelled to buy this. So even if there were an Ether ETF, it's not suddenly like everybody's going to be forced to buy 5% of it for their accounts. It's purely, people of their own volition. So again, where's the harm, especially in a ETF wrapper?
David, good point. Josh, I'd love your thoughts. Again, it was great to be down there with both of you. Give me your perspectives.
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was extremely valuable just for the benefit of those watching. The day we went there was the day before the Lummis-Gillibrand payment stablecoin bill was released, and that bill is, I don't know if you guys discussed it before I joined.
Not yet.
But it should be applauded in many ways for proposing a sort of state and federal, like a dual banking system path forward, which many people have been talking about as being a need. So I think as David noted and as Ron noted, those in Washington are hard at work and certainly very focused on these topics, even in an election year, right? Like it hasn't, the work hasn't stopped. What I do think, and I would love to hear your thoughts about whether you guys agree, but it seemed as though there really is an opportunity, or maybe a vacuum as we look at about thinking about for regulators. Okay, say we still do not get bills passed that clarify certain distinctions between, when is a digital asset not a security, right? Some of them are. I know Fit 21 is working its way through, and let's all hope. But really thinking about, okay, the SEC has proposed rules such as the definition, expanding the definition of exchange that hasn't gone forward, right? There are all these questions. We're not sure what's going to happen with legislation. So really thinking about how to help or what to do to set up something so that in the event that there is a change at the helm of the SEC, there is some kind of updated framework with recommendations for how the staff could view digital assets and potentially the Howey test. Things
Right.
like this about what should we as an industry be doing so that in the event that the opportunity arises,
Mm-hmm.
that we're there with specific recommendations for interpretations by staff who may be friendlier to the industry's positions. I also think, part of what we saw, at least in my mind, is a validation, at least by some, of what we've been talking about previously, and what certainly Dina and others have been as well, which is looking at things through a national security lens. And that is both with respect to legislators and certainly we've seen a whole bunch of AML bills, and we see a lot from other regulators as well. Perhaps this idea, again, like you think about technologies that are overlapping, AI, video games, etc., but really trying to show the promise and the, for example, putting forward that in a world where it's increasingly hard to tell the real from the unreal, like AI and deepfakes, the blockchain can be used to authenticate statements and things out that we're talking about for a long time, but I think the time is now to really push this.
Josh, I agree with you. I agree with both of you, and you made some interesting points. And one of the interesting things around clarity, if there's a change in administration, even something basic as, and I don't mean to overuse this phrase because we've been hearing it for many years, come in and register. There will be a need at some point to actually define what does that mean in a way that an industry can easily respond to. And I think the other thing that I'd like to add to all of that, and again, agreeing with both of you, we see the representatives in both the House and the Senate that are fervent in their advocacy for innovation in this country. And we see how they, them and particularly the staffers, they understand the tech, they understand the impact, they understand this means the evolution of global markets. But there's still what we used to call the education curve back in the day. And David, you and I think Josh, you and I were talking about this during our first trip to DC, which was there's a whole contingent of representatives where they either don't realize their constituencies are involved or it's just not their priority. So we still work to educate in a way that I think is very, very important. And I think that work will need to continue. So yeah, we'll probably be back in DC. We are not lobbyists, but it's always great to meet some of the folks who really understand where this is all going. Josh, David, what I'd like to do, and I know we only have a few minutes left. David, you and I spend a lot of time during the week either texting or chatting about the macroeconomic landscape and where things are going. So, of course, every morning I wake up and I've got business news running and suddenly it's, oh, great, new economic data. That is just really crappy for some of what we're thinking. This morning, the PCE, the personal consumption expenditures, which is the Fed's preferred measure of inflation, I think the estimate was supposed to be below 2.5. I could be wrong. It ended up being 2.8. Inflation is sticky. Economic growth is slowing. David, you and I saw that data point earlier this month. Apologies. And I think we're both old enough to remember stagflation, or at least reading about it. Where are we going with this data, and how is it going to affect crypto?
Well, I think these numbers are sort of showing the reckoning that people are seeing in just their daily lives, and with, costs escalating, hotels, flights. And so I think that these, numbers we're seeing are reflecting that. So I think ultimately we sort of have a problem where, costs are going up, but employment is staying down, and it's creating this, like you said, this very difficult environment. And I think we definitely called it right here that we didn't see interest rates being lowered. The crystal ball was in full effect on that one, and we may only get one rate cut this year. So I think we've been right about that. And I think the other thing with the jobs, one thing we should point out is that a lot of these jobs are temp jobs, and they're not white collar jobs. And there was a journal article, again, talking about things we've been talking about. And so I think that as we get some of the revisions to these numbers in the next couple of months, we'll get more clarity around that. But
Yeah.
I certainly don't expect to see a rate cut before the fall, and maybe we don't see one in 2024. What do you think, Ron?
For the audience watching, I just want to point out that David, his nickname now is Nostradamus Brill here at WSBA headquarters. David, I tend to agree with you, and you and I spent a lot of time looking at macroeconomic trends, but at a tactical level, when we look at some of the prices that might have been affected by some of this, I'm pleasant. Like BTC holds its own, still up 50% year to date. I know that some of the air has been taken out of it in the past month or so. I think the altcoins, which I believe you and I agree in many instances are kind of very speculative and probably not the best for anyone to be particularly buying. So I look at these as potential opportunities. I really am stunned by the macroeconomic impact. And to me, BTC in particular, and this is not investment advice, is potentially that inflation hedge. I think that's one of the reasons it's maintaining its price. And I'll say this, David, I'd love your opinions on this. In the wake of ETF outflows that we've seen, and yet still we're seeing BTC hold on to a price that shows some gains. Am I wrong? And Josh, obviously, we don't talk with you about economics much, but I'd love your perspective. And is this affecting clients? But David, am I wrong in that context?
No, look, but we have to remember that a lot of people are moving out of GBTC because of the fees that they charge, and they were taking advantage of that premium prior to the ETF being approved.
Yep.
I'll push back a little bit on the altcoins because I am a fan of a number of the different projects, but they are more speculative than Bitcoin is. But look, I think it's clear that currencies are being inflated, and that BTC is a hedge against that. And I think the more people who have access to these ETFs, the more I think you're going to see adoption and more buying. And I'm going to reiterate this again. I know you're probably both tired of hearing this from me, but the major wirehouses still are not allowing people, or just a trickle of people, to purchase the ETFs. Sure. And that's a lot of purchasing that people want to do that they're still being prevented from doing. So I still think there's demand out there, and I still think that there's interest, and I do think this is going to become more of an inflation hedge as time goes on.
And David, to be clear, I'm not suggesting, I believe some of the altcoins have really interesting longer term use cases. I didn't mean to imply that they all don't. I just think some of them don't. Josh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
So while I can't provide insights on this area, you guys are far more knowledgeable about it than I am. I am curious about your thoughts about, for example, what's been said, just announcements by the European Central Bank officials the past few days that they're planning to continue to cut interest rates multiple times per year, despite what the U.S. does and what the Fed does. How does that play in, not to put you guys on the spot, but I'm just curious, do you consider the non-U.S. actions as well? I mean, I know oil prices remain high, and but it's at least from what was said within the past couple of days, that the European Central Bank is still planning multiple rate cuts. How should we think about that when we think about crypto?
Yeah, good point. David, you want to start?
Well, I think if you have cheaper rates in Europe and you have higher rates here, it makes a stronger dollar.
That's right.
And that has impacts on the cost of goods. Selling goods overseas is harder because it costs more for folks in other jurisdictions that have a lower interest rates and currency. So I think that's an issue. But look, every economy is different. Just because we're not doing it doesn't mean that European economies have a different impact than we have. So I think it's good for their economies and a little tougher for ours if we have a stronger dollar.
I agree with you, David. The other aspect of that, and Josh, to that, it's a really good point.
Yep.
I always ask the fundamentals of why are they cutting interest rates, and arguably many of the reasons for cutting interest rates will be tied to diminished economic activity. And you have to worry about are they marching towards recession in Europe faster than we might be in the US, and what is the economic impact of that? It'll be interesting to see. It'll be interesting to see, particularly going back in time. David, you probably remember Japan, by way of example, had 0 or negative interest rates for well over a decade. Now they've got inflation. Now so there are these interesting dynamics of where will capital go in a kind of economic order like that, and what the three of us often talk about is how much of that capital will end up being allocated in some way to crypto. So, Josh, it's a very important point. We can't have the kind of macroeconomic conversation and crypto conversation in the silo of the U.S. It just doesn't make sense. But there's always lots to cover. We're
Sorry.
Go for it. No, go for it.
One of you guys, and it sounded like you guys were getting at this when David, you mentioned that some of the jobs are really more of temporary and not high income. It's interesting. We've heard a lot of high profile layoffs in the past, including by a lot of household names, whether in the tech space or beyond. And I guess in terms of how this is calculated and what it's showing, I mean, is there any sort of metric that does take into account, like, are these lower income jobs than what's coming out? Like, how does this get reconciled, if at all?
I don't think the government does the reconciling so much. I mean, they kind of give you some indications, but a lot of the hiring's been by government, which I'm not quite sure I understand, because it seems like governments, both on a state and federal level, seem to be fully staffed. Yeah. So I do wonder about that, but I think we are seeing, those kind of jobs. You're right. We're seeing high profile, white collar layoffs. I don't think we're seeing, the same amount of hiring. Although I think, Josh, if we see that hiring, it's not done on a massive scale. It's sort of done as white collar hiring is done sort of selectively, and there's a finite amount of roles being hired. But I think we hear the layoffs more because they're just done in the aggregate. But I think that the quality of jobs being created, when you think about like poor on an income level, is less than the layoffs and the reductions we're seeing.
David, the other side of that also, and pardon me, not to be conspiracy theorist about it, it's easy for any administration, Republican or Democrat, to point to job gains as an election issue when the government's the one hiring and creating the job gains. And I always, I go back to my Echo 101 days, David, but it's always the question of, is that actually distorting markets? And that's one of the concerns you and I have.
Yeah, I think that could be a whole afternoon podcast with some PhDs and some. But look, I do think the more transparent the jobs reports are, the better. The less reductions and changes that have to be made month over month is better for us. But one can hope at some point we'll see less revisions. Yeah.
Hope springs eternal. I think we're just about out of time. David, when the crew takes out the 100-foot sailboat for you and you go sailing over the weekend, what are you going to be doing this weekend and the week coming up? It's good to see you both, but I'd love your thoughts. And
Well, I'm fortunate to be supporting a charity that's very important to me tonight called Orphan Starfish. I'll be down in Miami to support that, but I have a lot of reading to do. Between the consensus filings, and some of the other, regulatory filings, I'll be doing that, and then I'm going to be watching the markets because we're again sort of testing again some ranges that I'm interested in. Bitcoin around 60 to 62, and altcoins, we've had this stealthy sell-off in altcoins.
Yeah.
So I'm sort of watching where they go, and are we sort of bottoming out, or do we have another leg down? So I'm going to be, doing some of that.
David, we also didn't mention, because we missed last week, the Bitcoin halving is now behind us, which if you don't mind, the both of you, I think it's worth 30 seconds of, has Bitcoin held up the way we thought it would?
I mean, I think it has. I think optimistically, I had hoped that we might see some forward momentum into a new high, but I think, the logical side of my brain has said in other halvings, things have been sort of, static to maybe dropping a little bit after. So I think right now we're in that pattern.
Got it. Josh, before the helicopter picks you up at Roosevelt Island from Cornell Tech, where I'm sure is an amazing speech, what will you be doing this weekend? We have our legal working group meeting. So like David, I'll be reading through the consensus brief But what are your thoughts?
So I will be reading and working. As you guys are probably more than well aware, things have not that they ever went away, but things have really roared back. And I think 22 and 2023 are way in the rear view at this point. I
Yep.
think, a lot of the activity this week or not this week, but so far in 2024, notwithstanding the cases that may be filed or may be previewed, I just think it's very busy.
For the audience, I want to point out that anytime either David or I speak to Josh, any day of week or almost any time of day, she's actually still working. It is unbelievable.
Yeah.
All right.
What about you, Ron? What are you going to be doing this weekend?
I will be. I promised my wife a nice lunch tomorrow. I will also be mourning. We had to chop down some trees that were falling here. I will also be doing a lot of reading and preparing for our legal working group meeting. Again, one other thing on May 1st, we have we all referenced the IRS's proposed 1099 DA form, which has lots of issues, is problematic, is interesting from the perspective of how will people get this data from their brokers and how will they work with their accountants. David, when you're getting your 1099 DA for 2024 early next year, how much data will be there and how much more will you need to supplement? So we're running a great webinar on it on May 1st. You can see it on our LinkedIn page as well. To register, open to the public, share with your friends. Yeah, busy times with summer coming up on us, my friends. It's good to see you both. Thank you for everyone in the audience who joined us. We will be back next week. Have a great weekend, everybody.
Take care.